Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our subject, Philosophy of Business Management. By the way, my name is Rohan Renara, and our topic for today is all about psychoanalysis and psychiatry, managing mind. So first, I will introduce to you the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. So basically, the set of psychological theories and therapeutic methods have originated in his work. The primary assumption of psychoanalysis is the belief that all people possess unconscious thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories. To explain further, please watch this video.
We couldn't talk about the theories of personality or psychology without mentioning Freud. Sigmund Freud is one of the most famous and controversial minds of the 20th century. His psychoanalytic perspective of personality offers a unique way of looking at the body and mind connection to personality. So in order to know Freud, we have to know three following terms: the id, the ego, and the superego. These are the three parts of your personality, well, according to Freud. These three characters are driven by unconscious energy. Now, a person may not always hear or talk to these parts of their personality, but they are all silently going through a struggle to influence our decisions and our behavior. The id is the bad boy of our subconscious. It is an impulsive part of the psyche that seeks pleasure and avoids pain at all costs. The id wants instant gratification. It is the part of you that grabs for food as a baby or acts to satisfy sexual desires without thinking it through. Now, the superego lies on the opposite end of the spectrum. This part of the psyche wants to control the id. If humans acted only based on receiving instant gratification and immediate pleasure, we would surely be in a whole lot of trouble. The superego unconsciously and consciously acts to follow the rules of society and tries to keep the id from causing some serious damage long term. Now, the ego lies in between the middle of these two entities, in between the id and the superego. The ego is in constant struggle to balance out these two forces and try to make pleasurable decisions without causing too much damage. It's like a well-minded adult standing in the middle of two children wanting to overthrow each other. So, how do Freud's ideas influence the way that we shape our personality? Well, one of his theories was that as a child grows into an adult, they encounter 5 psychosexual stages of development. During each of these stages of development, the id is focused on a specific erogenous zone. Now, the ego must struggle to balance out the pleasure-seeking id and the moral superego. During each of these phases, internal conflicts will result in many different types of struggles. Now, Freud said personality is formed by the process and the results of each of these struggles. So there are 5 basic stages. The first one is oral, the second one is anal, the third one is phallic, the fourth one is latency, and the fifth one is genital. Freud believes that most of our personality has actually been formed by the time that we reach age 5. At the age of 5, a child has gone through the oral, the anal, and most of the phallic stages. Now, if the child continues to struggle with balance during these stages, they will develop something called fixations. For example, stage 1 is the oral stage. Oral fixations include smoking or problems with eating. If someone fails to master potty training, or they still struggle during the anal stage, then as they grow into an adult, they may become a sloppy or a lazy person. This is actually where we get the term anal retentive. During the third stage, the phallic stage, Freud believed that boys and girls start to notice the differences in each other and develop either the Oedipus complex or penis envy. The Oedipus complex is the idea that unconsciously, young boys feel possessive of their mother, and as a result, they feel very aggressive towards their father. Freud also believed that young girls experience something called penis envy, and due to their lack of a penis, develop fixations to follow them until they're an adult. If Freud's ideas make you uncomfortable, either for the fact that he focuses explicitly on sex or that he seems to frame women as the lesser sex, you're not alone. Actually, it was a little weird talking about these into a microphone. Freud has never ceased to face criticism for his work. Unlike many psychologists, he actually did not use empirical research or studies to back up his theories. He worked solely with adults on a case-by-case basis. Still, however, the psychoanalytic perspective remains as one of the top personality theories to date. Unlike the humanist theory, Freud's focus remains in the unconscious. He explores the idea that in order to develop the root of our personality, we have to dig deeper than what we experience on the surface. Psychoanalytic therapy grew out of Freud's theories. This approach involves a therapist questioning their patient about their childhood memories or possible events in the past that might have led to struggles between the id and the superego. Freud believed that humans repress a lot of their emotions. Now, his goal during therapy sessions was to bring those unconscious feelings and emotions into the conscious mind. So this last theory that I'm going to talk about, the psychoanalytic theory, gives us a lot to think about when it comes to the development of our personality. How many events in your life can you point out as defining moments that shaped your personality? And how many events could have changed your personality without even you thinking about it? So this is kind of the end of the theory section. We went over trait theory, behavioral theory, humanistic theory, biological theory, and lastly, psychoanalytical.
So that was Freud thought of personality, that there are personality structures, the the ego, and superego. So first, id, the devil, a reservoir of unconscious psychic energy, constantly striving to satisfy basic drives to survive, reproduce, and aggress. It is always needy and it operates according to the pleasure principle. Second is the superego or the angel. It represents internalized ideals and provides standards for judgment and for future aspirations. It always concerned on what is socially acceptable. It pushes us to tame the ego ideal or our view of what is right and represents our conscience or our view of what is considered to be wrong. And third is the ego, the largely conscious or the executive part of personality that, according to Freud, mediates the demands of the id, the superego, and the reality. In 1894-1896, Sigmund Freud noted a number of ego defenses, which he refers to throughout his written works. These defense mechanisms are psychological strategies that are unconsciously used to protect a person from anxiety arising from unacceptable thoughts or feelings, or because he or she feels threatened or his id or superego becomes too demanding.
Freud came up with the idea of defense mechanisms, which is when the reality principle or the ego is distorted in order to protect itself from anxiety or negative feelings from id impulses. Defense mechanisms can be positive or negative ways to deal with negative feelings. This is Marcus, and this is Sally. They're both in middle school and have a big dance coming up. Sally has a crush on Marcus, but is worried that if she told anyone, it would get out and Marcus would reject her. If Sally were to use the defense mechanism denial, she would deny or not believe her true feelings or id impulses of having a crush on Marcus to avoid the anxiety of putting herself out there and being rejected. If Sally were to use the defense mechanism reaction formation, she would say the exact opposite of how she feels or what her impulses are to avoid the anxiety of possibly getting rejected. So in this case, Sally would act like she does not like Marcus or thinks that he is gross to avoid the anxiety of being rejected by him. Another strategy to protect negative feelings from the ego or defense mechanism is projection. Projection is taking your true feelings and projecting them or saying that is how someone else feels. For example, if Sally tells Marcus that her friend Ethel has a crush on him, she would be projecting attraction toward Marcus on her friend Ethel. Another defense mechanism is displacement, where you take your feelings towards someone and displace them towards someone or something else. So let's take Sally, who gets asked out to the dance by Steve. Sally does not have to worry about getting rejected by Steve because he asked her out. However, she acts like she has a crush on Steve, even though in reality she thinks he's gross and really still has a crush on Marcus. Let's just say, since Sally did not express her true feelings to Marcus, who may or may not have reciprocated, Marcus decides to ask Stacy to the dance, and she says yes. So let's just say that Sally becomes angry that Stacy is going to the dance with Marcus and not her. So she ends up cursing at her teacher and then getting into trouble. Acting aggressive instead of expressing your true feelings is a defense mechanism called acting out. Let's say that Sally decides to go to her teacher, Mr. Johnson, after class and provides a genuine apology for acting out. She explains to her teacher that she was upset because the boy she liked is going out with someone else. This would be a mature or adaptive defense mechanism called humility. Sally admitted that what she had done was wrong and apologized to her teacher. Even though the teacher, Mr. Johnson, was initially upset with Sally, he accepted her apology and used a defense mechanism called forgiveness, which is also a mature defense mechanism. Sally is eventually able to tap into another defense mechanism, a mature defense mechanism called acceptance. She is upset about not going to the dance with Marcus, and she feels stuck with Steve, but decides that rather than expressing anger, which is inappropriate, she is going to accept the situation and try to have a fun time at the dance with Steve. Identifying a client's defense mechanisms and getting them to express their true feelings is one of the goals of Freudian psychoanalysis. Another popular defense mechanism is repression, or being unable to recall memories of traumatic events, such as sexual assaults, witnessing a death of a friend or loved one, because they're too emotional or painful. Dissociation is feeling separated from one's own body or identity because certain identities trigger painful thoughts or memories. Regression is going back to a previous stage of development to avoid painful thoughts or feelings, such as maybe an adult acting like a child.
The bottom line is, it's always human nature to want to protect yourself from negative feelings or experiences. So, defense mechanisms are not inherently bad. They can allow people to navigate their painful experiences or channel their energy more productively. They become problematic, however, when applied too frequently or for too long. Another name in psychology is the Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist Carl Jung, who founded analytic psychology. He was an early supporter of Sigmund Freud because of their shared interest in the unconscious. But their differences had split them, and Jung went on to develop his own version of psychoanalytic theory.
Man has developed consciousness slowly and laboriously, in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state. And this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness. These words were written by Carl Jung, a Swiss psychologist who lived from 1875 to 1961. In this video and a subsequent one, we will examine some of Jung's most important ideas, including his ideas on the conscious and unconscious realms of the mind, his theory of archetypes, and what he called the individuation process, which he saw as a path to self-knowledge and wholeness. A key to appreciating Jung's vast contributions to the field of psychology is knowledge of how Jung conceived of the psyche. The word psyche originally meant soul or spirit, but by the turn of the 20th century increasingly came to refer to mind. In Jungian psychology, one's psyche can be seen as their total personality, and encompasses all one's thoughts, behaviors, feelings, and emotions. Knowledge of the psyche, how it worked, and how one could influence its functioning was of the utmost concern for Jung. Broadly speaking, Jung divided the psyche into three main realms: consciousness, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. The different realms of the psyche are not completely separate from each other, but instead continually interact in a compensatory manner. This dynamic interplay between the conscious and unconscious realms of the psyche leads, as we will see, to the potential for personal growth and change through what Jung termed the individuation process. Before examining in more detail the unconscious realms of the psyche, we will first discuss consciousness, that realm of the psyche most familiar to us. The conscious realm of the psyche can be described as one's field of awareness, and consists of those psychic contents that one knows. At the center of this field of awareness was what Jung called the ego. The ego is one's personality as they are aware of it firsthand, or in the words of Jung, the ego forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness, and insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The ego plays a crucial role in each person's life as it acts as a gatekeeper which influences what contents of experience are reflected in consciousness and which contents are eliminated, repressed, or ignored. The ego, in its role as gatekeeper, helps determine the content of the next main area of the psyche we will look at, the personal unconscious. As Jung wrote, "There are certain events of which we have not consciously taken note. They have remained, so to speak, below the threshold of consciousness. They have happened, but they have been absorbed subliminally." These events that have been absorbed subliminally occupy the personal unconscious. The word subliminal translates to below the threshold, so what Jung means is that there are many events that the ego represses or disregards for various reasons, be it that they are too distressing or simply forgotten or deemed insignificant. But these events do not disappear completely from the psyche, but instead occupy the personal unconscious and continue to have the potential to influence one's personality. It must be stressed that the unconscious realm is not merely a receptacle for forgotten memories. Rather, as we mentioned earlier, the unconscious and conscious realms of the psyche dynamically interact, both playing an integral role in the life of the individual. One way that the personal unconscious influences one's behavior is through the impact of what Jung called complexes. Many people are familiar with the term complex in psychology. Sigmund Freud was famous for his idea of the Oedipus complex, while Alfred Adler, a contemporary of Jung's and Freud's, stressed the importance of the inferiority complex. Jung conceived of complexes as subpersonalities, which have the potential to exert powerful control over one's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, or as is explained in the classic introduction to Jung, a primer of Jungian psychology. One interesting and important feature of the personal unconscious is that groups of contents may come together to form a cluster or constellation. Jung called them complexes. When we say a person has a complex, we mean he is strongly preoccupied by something that he can hardly think about anything else. In modern parlance, he has a hang-up. A strong complex is easily noticed by others, although the person himself may not be aware of it. Freud, who was Jung's mentor for a period of time, believed that a complex largely arose due to traumatic childhood experiences. However, Jung was not satisfied with this explanation. His dissatisfaction with Freud's explanation led him on a search for what it was in the psychic realm that gave rise to complexes. And what he was to discover was that the roots of complexes resided in a layer of the unconscious that was deeper and more fundamental than the personal unconscious, which he called the collective unconscious. This discovery was spurred by extensive analysis of the unconscious material of his patients, such as their dreams and fantasies, as well as his study of comparative religion and mythology. What Jung noticed was that not only were there uncanny similarities between unconscious material of different patients, but more interestingly, there was also uncanny similarities in the major mythological motifs and religious symbols of different civilizations. This led Jung to propose that in addition to the conscious and personal unconscious realms of the psyche, there also existed another realm, as he wrote. From the unconscious there emanate determining influences which, independently of tradition, guarantee in every single individual a similarity and even a sameness of experience, and also of the way it is represented imaginatively. One of the main proofs of this is the almost universal parallelism between mythological motifs. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious was one of his most important contributions to the field of psychology. What Jung was proposing was that in addition to the personal unconscious, which is mainly composed of elements drawn from the individual's life experiences, the collective unconscious contains universal elements which are inherited. We can also find in the unconscious qualities that are not individually acquired but are inherited, instincts as impulses to carry out actions from necessity, without conscious motivation. In this deeper stratum, we find archetypes. The instincts and archetypes together form the collective unconscious. I call them collective because, unlike the personal unconscious, it is not made up of individual and more or less unique contents, but of those which are universal and of regular occurrence. According to Jung, archetypes are psychic structures which are common to all humans and constitute the archaic heritage of humanity. Archetypes can be described as cognitive categories or predispositions that humans are born with to think, feel, perceive, and act in specific ways. It is important to note that Jung did not believe that one could directly perceive an archetype. Rather, one can note their existence only by observing the images or symbols which are manifested as a result of their existence in the unconscious. Archetypes shouldn't be equated with symbols or images. Instead, archetypes manifest images and symbols along with various other phenomena. In the words of Anthony Stevens, archetypes possess the capacity to initiate, control, and mediate the common behavioral characteristics and typical experiences of all human beings. Thus, on appropriate occasions, archetypes give rise to similar thoughts, images, mythologisms, feelings, and ideas in people, irrespective of their class, creed, race, geographical location, or historical epoch. Some of the archetypes that Jung examined included those of the mother, birth, death, rebirth, power, the hero, and the child, to name but a few. However, as Jung stated, there are as many archetypes as there are typical situations in life. Endless repetition has engraved these experiences into our psychic constitution, not only in the forms of images filled with content, but at first only as forms without content, representing merely the possibility of a certain type of perception and action. The archetypes of the collective unconscious have a deep evolutionary basis, and Jung considered them to be inherited parts of the psyche. Jung thought it obvious that, just as the body has evolved over long periods of time, so too must the psyche have evolved certain predispositions and inherent tendencies as well, throughout our vast evolutionary lineage. Just as the human body represents a whole museum of organs, each with a long evolutionary history behind it, so we should expect to find that the mind is organized in a similar way. It can no more be a product without history than is the body in which it exists. By history, I do not mean the fact that the mind builds itself up by conscious reference to the past through language and other cultural traditions. I am referring to the biological, prehistoric, and unconscious development of the mind in archaic man, whose psyche was still close to that of the animal. While archetypes are formed over extremely long periods of time in an evolutionary manner and are common to all humans, they express themselves differently in each person. In other words, the archetypes interact in a dynamic manner with the individual experience of each person, and this leads to the formation of a unique personality. Jung believed it was of paramount importance for each individual to confront and integrate the contents of their unconscious, and thought the failure to do so would result in a fragmented individual. For the sake of mental stability and even physiological health, the unconscious and the conscious must be integrally connected and thus move on parallel lines. If they are split apart or dissociated, psychological disturbance follows. This process of confronting the unconscious was, according to Jung, a path to self-knowledge which he called the individuation process. As Jung commented, "I use the term individuation to denote the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity or whole."
That was Carl Jung's view about the unconsciousness and the cause of behavior. However, he highlighted that every individual is an exception to the rule. I think that Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud's theories are both necessary. We cannot appreciate Jung without Freud, and we cannot appreciate Freud without Jung. And I believe that human behavior and human personality is far too broad and too complicated to be understood. One thing is that psychoanalysis proves to be an important factor in business, in management, and in leadership. The fact that being able to learn psychoanalysis gives a predictable spectrum of what may and may not be the right actions in a certain situation, and it is an advantage that all managers should carry throughout his career. So I think this ends my presentation. Thank you for watching.